This is 100 Years of Cox. You are listening to a podcast by Francis Thompson. The 10 siblings who wrote the budget were born between 1868 and 1884. Their father, John Charles, was from the wealthy Derbyshire Cox family. Their mother, Minnie, was from the illustrious family of Machell from Cumbria, whose ancestral seat was Crackenthorpe Hall. The 10 children were given the name Machell by their mother. Reverend Dr John Charles Cox, author, historian and genealogist, was very interested in the history of his wife's family. By 1912, Minnie had died, and Dr Cox and Vera were going through all of Mother's letters. Minnie kept 10 letters, written by her mother Matilda in the 1820s. They were all addressed to Matilda's favourite brother, known to the family as Uncle Christopher. The letters were written from 1823 to 1828, which was the year Matilda was married. The letters were sent back to Beverley in Yorkshire, where Christopher worked in the family business, Machell's Bank. Dr Cox had researched the family history of the Machell family, and he included an account written for his 10 children in the 1912 Christmas budget. This was one of the documents I discovered, safely preserved in the Bodleian Library in Oxford. Dr Cox wrote, "As each of you bears the name of Machell at your mother's special request, I thought you might like to be reminded, by way of introduction to these letters of your grandmother, of a few facts as to the family history." Dr Cox, ever the genealogist, researched the history of the Machell family back to the 13th century, including many ancestors named Hugh and Lancelot, and many anecdotes about what they got up to. This is a very brief history of the Machells. In 1768, Lancelot Machell inherited Crackenthorpe Hall in Cumbria, which is a vast country house and is still there today. But he was an outrageous spendthrift. All his money quickly disappeared, and he sold Crackenthorpe to Lord Lowther, Earl of Lonsdale, for £12,000. Christopher Machell, his brother, was abroad at the time, fighting in the American War of Independence. Christopher loses an arm at the Battle of Bunker's Hill in Boston in 1775. Then he returns to England to find the family home has been sold. He never speaks to his brother again. He never returns again to Cumbria, and instead settles in Beverley in Yorkshire. Christopher, with one arm, and Anne have 5 sons and 3 daughters. Several of the sons die in foreign wars, and 2 of the daughters don't survive. Matilda was therefore the youngest child, the only daughter, and would have been completely spoilt by her elderly parents and older brothers. Uncle Christopher, who works for Machell's Bank, the family firm in Beverley, was Matilda's favourite oldest brother. He is the one that Matilda writes her letters to when she's in London for the season with her chaperone looking for a husband. Crackenthorpe Hall was later bought back by another Machell, Captain Jim, a trainer who made a fortune from horse racing at Newmarket and owned 3 Grand National winners. Captain Jim was a grumpy and difficult man, but had a good eye for horses. Machell Place House and Stables, an historic training yard, is still there in the centre of Newmarket, named after Captain Jim, my erratic and grumpy ancestor. Crackenthorpe Hall is a Grade 2 listed country mansion in Cumbria in the north of England. It's no longer owned by the Machell family, but it's still there, unlike many glorious old houses that were demolished. It is huge and ornate. It has its own resident ghost, and it can be hired for a fabulous country house weekend. A painting of Christopher Machell, my 4th great-grandfather with one arm, hangs above one of the fireplaces. And another interesting thing about Crackenthorpe is that Agatha Christie used the name in one of her Miss Marple books, the 450 from Paddington. The Crackenthorpe brothers are involved in the murder, as is the Crackenthorpe estate, the maids and the housekeeper, etc. But there's no indication that Agatha Christie was talking about Crackenthorpe Hall in Cumbria. The year is 1912. Dr Cox is writing to his 10 children about Matilda, their grandmother, and her letters to Uncle Christopher, and his account was included in the 1912 Christmas budget. This is what Dr Cox wrote. Matilda, your grandmother. Uncle Christopher was simply devoted to her. He said that she was the undoubted belle of the East Riding, if not the belle of all Yorkshire, that she was a wonderful pianist and singer, and that she had a perfect seat on horseback. There were 5 pictures of her at the house in Hengate in Beverley, in addition to the 2 that we have. There was a pencil sketch and an Indian ink wash, both by her father, and a good large oil painting, I forget who by, which was over the chimney-piece in the drawing-room. She was born in October 1800, was married in 1827 to Edward Smith, and buried at Ruth in Yorkshire in 1844, where there is a mural monument to her memory, which I more than once visited with your mother. They lived in rather a small but charming old house at Ruth. As this is a mere family document, there is no harm in saying that John and Edward Smith were the 2 sons of a very wealthy timber merchant of Gainsborough. In the parish church you can see various Smith monuments. They were left orphans at an early age. When they came of age and possessed of their very large fortunes, they both kicked over the traces in gambling and horse racing. John dissipated the whole. Edward pulled up in time, though not until his income had dwindled from £10,000 to £1,000, as Uncle Christopher used to say, and then he was persuaded to invest the balance of his fortune in Yorkshire land, as he had various good friends at Beverley and Hull. As to the marriage between Edward Smith and Matilda, Uncle Christopher used to say, Matilda might have married a score of times when younger, but she was so particular. On the death of Uncle Christopher, who made me his executor, as representing your mother, his favourite niece, who often lived with him for a month or 2 at a time, there was much unpleasantness with Canon Machell, his eldest nephew, who was not mentioned in his will. But your mother and I did our best to make peace by asking him to accept a variety of papers, letters, medals, swords, pictures, and other quasi-heirlooms, and a little plate with the Machell crest on it. There were boxes full of old letters and documents, which I used to pore over. I think these all eventually went to Captain Jim. Your mother naturally decided to keep her mother's letters to her brother Christopher, and I put aside several about the Peninsular War and a few of still greater value from your great-grandfather Christopher Machell as to the American War of Independence. None of the latter can I find, and I begin to think we must have given them to Captain Jim at the time when he repurchased Crackenthorpe in the 1870s, when we were living in Hazelwood in Derbyshire. Mother was very pleased about Captain Jim becoming the owner of Crackenthorpe, and when he wrote to us begging to be allowed to purchase any possible Machell relics that we might have retained, we sent him, as a present, 6 silver teaspoons, approximately 1750, carrying the Machell crest. Matilda's letters. I now proceed to give a selection of your grandmother's letters to her favourite brother Christopher. I had thought of giving a few brief annotations, but reasons of space and expense check me, and perhaps it is better to let them speak entirely for themselves. Several of the Beverley and other names are quite familiar to me from having heard your mother, and more especially Uncle Christopher, mention them in conversation. Matilda Machell's letter, East Parade, Leeds, Tuesday 1st of April, probably 1823. "Oh, I must commence with that emphatic monosyllable. Oh, my dear Christopher, why did you not come with me and enjoy what I have enjoyed as never a person enjoyed enjoyment before? You must not expect a rational letter from me, for that is utterly out of the question. After the exquisite treat of yesterday, do not scold me for expressing foolish enthusiasm, or affecting more than I felt. Do you know, I very nearly made a fool of myself at church. Mr Sapio is more exquisite than I could have conceived. His first song of Comfort Ye My People was splendid, but his second, deeper and deeper still, was what so nearly overcame my self-command. I had never heard it before, and his voice, which is one of the finest mellow tenors, left you nothing to wish for. His taste is so chaste and pure, no flourishes like Mr Braham, all elegant. In short, I never was so fascinated, and Mrs Salmon is quite delightful. Her song, accompanied by Mr Mori on the violin obbligato, was, I thought, not to be surpassed, until Mr Sapio sang one, accompanied by Mr Lindley on the violoncello obbligato, and that was beyond what my imagination has carried me in my most mad moments of musical enthusiasm. We had 4 hours and a half of sacred music in the church with hardly any cessation. The choruses were wonderfully well got up for that sort of thing. Tell Robert we heard a great favourite of his sung very beautifully by a young boy, the part of Haydn's Creation, which manuscript he sent me from Cambridge, beginning the marvellous work. Consider that I had never heard any of Haydn's Creation before, and hardly any of the Messiah. And then to hear it for the first time so exquisitely sung, I confess it was almost enough to drive me out of my rational senses. The selection of music in the evening was in very bad taste. They made Mr Sapio waste his beautiful voice on A Smile to a Tear and The Cold Flinty Rock, etc., which made him out of humour, and he would not, or indeed scarcely could not, exert himself. He was so much fatigued by the singing in the morning. Mrs Salmon was, in our opinion, a little tipsy, and gave herself most abominable airs, and then said she would not sing. But still it was most delightful. But the people were such sticks, such insensible wretches, that they let both Sapio and her sing till they almost dropped, without any applause, save from a few good judges in our end of the room. And now for Mr Lindley and Mr Mori. Lindley's concerts surpassed every idea I had formed of the powers of the violoncello. I was absolutely breathless, as much from astonishment as delight. He shuts his eyes and throws back his head in such a delightful ecstasy at his own tones, and looks so happy that I was almost in love with his fat, round, good-humoured face. But now, oh, Mori, wherefore art thou Mori? It surely is impossible that the violin can be carried to greater excellence. I thought Dr Cammage a brilliant player, but he is as inferior as Mr Lambert is to Mr Lindley. Do you know, he ran down the chromatic to the E an octave higher than our piano in thirds, in the most rapid manner and in perfect tune, and his violin was such a beautiful, such a magnificent toned one, that in short I was absolutely bewildered and very nearly crazed. Had I come 70 miles to hear only one of those I have mentioned, I should have thought myself amply repaid, but 4 all at once! Oh, I think of them each separately, and know not which to admire the most. But Mr Sapio's voice dwells the longest in my ear. He is a young man, and has been with the dragoons, as he did not like professional singing, but on being paid off, he returned to it, and is quite superseding Mr Braham in town. But he has not made himself cheap at the theatres, and therefore as yet is not so well known as Mr Braham is, though he is in the highest fashion in town at the concerts. And now, having given vent to some of my delight, I must talk a little about the Leeds folks. The handsomest woman I have seen yet is Miss Mary Gott, and she really is beautiful, but she does not have very good style. The church was very much crowded, and there were the Cathcarts, the Lowthers, the Armitages, the Beckets, and some other great folk there, all very good looking, so that we, East Riding stars, were merely seen in the smoky hemisphere. Do you remember a very dark man who used to be at dinners when we were at Scarborough? A clergyman, his name was Lonsdale. You know, he used to torment Eugenia Hall and I by staring. No sooner had I got into my seat at church than I cast my eyes on my friend opposite, and to my dismay and annoyance he recognised me. I did not, however, know him to speak to, and I never could get quit of his great black eyes after. And at the concert later, to my horror, he seated himself directly opposite again, and he stared till I almost got cross, though between ourselves I could scarcely help laughing, as he would cast up his eyes and make so many antics that everybody observed the idiot, and I got horribly quizzed by a very pleasant young man whom Margaret introduced to me, a Mr Tom Bischoff. They are the very proper people here. I never saw so few passable men in my whole life. I saw Mr William Beckett, and he did not make a great impression. There were 3 of the young men named Beckett at the concert. Oh, I forgot to tell you that we made one very pleasant acquaintance, a young man who dined here on Sunday, a Mr Edward Fenton. He is very handsome and very gentlemanlike, but in very bad health. I could not imagine how he came to know so much of myself. He told me that I was invited to the officers' ball at York on the 9th, and he hoped very much that I should go, as many would be much disappointed if I did not. He was exceedingly amused to see me puzzling about to discover from whom and where he had heard of me, for he told me that he could almost fancy he knew me, as he had heard me so much talked about by a friend of his. And at last I found out that he is the own cousin of Charles Lee, and it was from that quarter that Miss Matilda had been mentioned. We are going to the ball on Thursday with Mrs Bennion, who is one of the proper people here. She has 2 very nice daughters and a good-looking, gentlemanlike son, so we shall do very well. Mrs Appleby is all kindness and attention, and will not hear of our leaving her till Saturday. And even then she will not let me go without a promise to come and visit her again soon. Gilby is the most amusing, old-fashioned being that ever was. We cannot help behaving ill some time. You shall hear all the news when we meet on Saturday. Send the horses for me to Hull on that day. We shall in all probability be in Hull at 2, and I should like to be at home on that day. Adieu! I am in great fuss as usual. Best love to all, not forgetting Bet, and believe me, dear Christopher, yours most affectionately, Matilda. The people here are very polite and attentive. Do write me. You never heard such a piano as Mrs Appleby's. We have prevailed on her to let us have one from the music shop for Emma's evening party, as it is quite impossible to play on this one. Margaret desires her love to be sent. She is very good and kind to me. It is fabulous to have old letters to read, but the real interest comes when information can be found online about the people mentioned, meaning the story can be fleshed out further. Matilda talks about 4 musicians who were almost enough to drive her out of her rational senses. In other words, she thought the musicians were fabulous. In the early 1800s, there were no recordings. Records had not been invented, nor had the radio. I think records first exist in 1860s. You could only hear musicians by going to see them play live, so performing was everything. Matilda writes about Mrs Eliza Salmon and Mr Louis Sapio, who are both singers, Mr Nicholas Mori, the violinist, and Mr Lindley, the cellist, and she tells her brother off, saying, "Why did you not come with me? You have missed the most amazing concert." Matilda was 23 when she wrote this letter, in 1823. She was also an excellent pianist, and her brother Christopher was also a musician. They were a musical family, and so Matilda knew what she was talking about. Mrs Eliza Salmon was a soprano, and in 1823 she was 36 years old. According to Grove's dictionary, her voice was a pure soprano of the most beautiful quality, of extensive compass, with a very brilliant tone and extraordinary flexibility. I thought that women in the 1800s generally didn't perform as musicians once they were married. It was very much a man's world, and women had far fewer opportunities. Evidently, this wasn't the case for Eliza. She was singing oratorios at Covent Garden in 1803, and she went on to become a popular concert singer. Eliza was in great demand at concerts, oratorios and festivals in both town and country, and she had a successful career. Unfortunately, she acquired the habit of intemperance, which probably means she became an alcoholic. Matilda writes that she and her companions thought Mrs Salmon's singing was delightful, but she seemed a bit tipsy during the concert in Leeds in April 1823. Mrs Salmon also developed derangement of the nervous system, and in 1825 she suddenly lost her voice. Things went downhill for Eliza, and sadly she died in poverty in 1849. Louis Sapio was described by the newspapers as being a tenor of great promise. By 1823 he was singing at Drury Lane and Covent Garden in London, and the Literary Gazette reported, "Mr Sapio's tenor is unquestionably a charming organ, but we cannot forgive a singer who ornaments the recitative of Handel." Matilda disagrees. She says Mr Sapio sings without flourishes, unlike Mr Braham, who was another celebrated singer of the time. In Matilda's opinion, Mr Braham sang Handel, adding unpopular ornamentation, but she held Mr Sapio's singing in high regard. Sapio sang oratorio and opera and was a public favourite. He often sang alongside Mrs Salmon in concerts. In 1823, he was 31 years old. Unfortunately, he was not good at managing his affairs, and he died in poverty in 1851. Nicholas Mori was a violinist and a conductor. He had been a musical child prodigy and was a real 1800s success story. When the brand new Royal Academy of Music in London was formed, Mr Mori was the first professor of violin. He was a fabulous violinist, but he was overshadowed by Paganini, and his name is not well known today. In 1823, he was 26 years old. The Times newspaper published a list of violinists in 1831, including Nicholas Mori and Paganini, among others. Remember, there were no recordings. The Times was listing the best musicians of the day and advising its readers who they should go to see playing in a concert. The playing of Mori was described as this: rich, full and beautiful tone, polished taste, masterly variety of style, and extraordinary brilliancy of execution. But Paganini's playing was even more impressive. The Times described him with just one word: everything. I originally thought Matilda was talking about William Lindley, the cellist, but I think it was possibly his father, Robert Lindley, who was performing in Leeds in 1823. Robert was a better cellist and had a more successful career than his son. In 1822, Robert Lindley was appointed as one of the first professors of the new Royal College of Music, alongside Mr Mori, the violinist. William Husk, a music critic in the 1800s, described his playing. Lindley's tone was remarkable for its purity, richness, mellowness and volume. He had a great reputation as an accompanist. Today's classical musicians mostly just play the notes on the page in front of them. But in the 1800s, the concert cellists were required to improvise whilst accompanying singers. Matilda wrote about Mr Lindley's playing, "I was absolutely breathless, as much from astonishment as delight." I have found several music festivals and concerts at York and Leeds and elsewhere in England in the 1820s with these four people listed as the soloists. They were clearly popular at the time. Concerts were often held in the large and newly built churches in the centre of cities. Matilda appears to be describing a concert that happened during the day, and then there would have been a break before another concert in the evening. Matilda is staying with Mrs Appleby on East Parade, along with companions and chaperones. If you look at an online map, you will see that East Parade is right in the centre of Leeds. The posh houses were not in the suburbs in the 1820s, they were right in the middle of town. The few old houses that remain on East Parade today are where the wealthy and influential people of Leeds would once have lived. The houses are tall and large with many stories. The grand drawing room would have been on the first floor, and the house would require a good number of servants. I'm not sure who Emma was, but she was having an evening party, and Mrs Appleby's piano was terrible. Matilda persuaded Mrs Appleby to hire a piano from the music shop for their evening party. They would have been singing, and Matilda would have played the piano, and there may well have been dancing as well, if the house was large enough. Sadly, Matilda did not write down on her letter the number of the house on East Parade that she was staying in. She didn't write the year either, but Dr Cox in 1912 estimated that this letter was from 1823. Matilda and her family lived in Beverley, the East Riding of Yorkshire. They were wealthy, and they lived in one of the old houses on Hengate, which is adjacent to St Mary's Church. The house is probably still there today, but again, I don't know what number they lived at. Matilda says she's travelled 70 miles to attend the concert, but it was worth travelling that far. It is indeed 70 miles from Beverley to Leeds, but only if you go via Hull. Have a look online. The direct route from Beverley to Leeds does not go via Hull. It's possible that there wasn't a direct road from Beverley to Leeds, or that the road was poorly maintained, or maybe it was expensive to travel by carriage, as fresh horses would be needed along the way, and travellers would have needed to stop the night at a coaching inn. I know that Matilda and her family were wealthy, but from her letters it is also clear that Matilda was thrifty. Matilda asks her brother Christopher to send horses to Hull when she comes home in a few days. Matilda and her chaperones travelled by horseback from Beverley to Hull. Then they got on a steamboat along the River Ouse to Selby, and then the last section from Selby to Leeds was probably by carriage. Steamboat might also have been more comfortable than a carriage. Who knows? So many possibilities. If you are listening to this and you know more about this, please do email me. It is fascinating to hear Matilda's opinions of all the people she mixed with. There were a lot less people living in England in the 1800s, and I expect Matilda would have known all the people in Yorkshire who were in her social circle. The wealthy, the titled, and the aristocratic. Benjamin Gott was a millionaire. He was a mill owner and an influential man in the Industrial Revolution in the early 1800s. His factory at Armley, which was on the outskirts of Leeds, was at one time the largest factory in the world. It is likely that Miss Mary Gott was his daughter. Matilda says she is very beautiful, but not very stylish. Young ladies in the 1800s could be just as rude about each other as young women are today, just via letter rather than on social media. It's very easy to picture Matilda at church, probably wearing an elaborate dress, including a corset, gloves and a bonnet, and she was people watching instead of listening to the sermon. She describes the wealthy local folk of Leeds and says herself and her companions from East Riding are very much on the edge, looking in. I don't know about you, but I've recently watched Bridgerton, and I get muddled about which king and queen were on the throne in which decade in the 1800s. King George III was the king who went mad, although scholars disagree about what his illness actually was. He is the king featured in Hamilton the musical, when America wants independence from England. In the show, George III sings, "When you're gone, I'll go mad, so don't throw away this thing we had." If you are a musician, like me, you'll love the musical motif for the words "Oceans rise, empires fall." It's like writing the word green in red ink. George III reigned for a long time. He became king in 1760. He was ill from 1811 until his death in 1820, and his son, who was also called George, was ruling England as regent whilst George III was ill. Queen Charlotte died in 1818 and George III died in 1820. So Bridgerton is clearly set pre-1818, as Queen Charlotte is one of the characters in the show. Strictly speaking, the Regency period was just 9 years, 1811 to 1820. George IV reigned from 1820 to 1830. He had a very extravagant lifestyle, and the Regency era is defined by his extravagant tastes, as well as the architecture, literature, culture and politics of the time. George IV was considered to be selfish, irresponsible and unreliable. Jane Austen's novels are set in the Regency era, and some consider the period to not just be 9 years, but to stretch from 1811 to the 1830s. Matilda wrote another letter to Christopher just 3 days later. Matilda's letter, East Parade, Leeds, Friday the 4th of April, probably 1823. To C.S. Machell, Esquire, Beverley. My dear Christopher, do not think that I am determined to ruin you in postage, but circumstances alters cases. The people have made so much of us that we absolutely cannot get away yet. We last night at the ball received such a very pressing invitation to a dinner and quadrille party in the evening at Mrs Bennion's, who was most kind to us at the ball, that we could not resist, and therefore, as Mrs Appleby will not hear of our leaving her tomorrow, as she has asked some young men to her house, we are obliged to give in, and will be with you on Monday instead. Ralph is obliged to return tomorrow, and we are provided with a proper escort in case he should not be able to return for us. And now for another affair which I am very much interested in accomplishing, the York ball on Wednesday, and now listen to our plans. Margaret and Ralph are invited. Now, we think it would be very expensive to post it to York merely for 1 day, and therefore we think if Ralph and Margaret were to take their gig and horse, and you or John and I ride our horses, I might ride halfway and drive the rest, and Margaret could then take my horse and ride the remainder of the way. Now, this would be attended with very little expense and very little trouble, and would be a nice quiet way, and much more agreeable than going in a post-chaise. We could easily return the next day, and it would be so very, very agreeable, and we have been so very much entreated, and people seem to wish it so very much. Now do, my dear Christopher, think of all this really and seriously. We could write to the Ditmases to get us a bed, and Margaret is certain Mrs Ann and Mrs Gage would chaperone us there, and with brothers we surely should be quite correct and proper, and it is to be desperately gay. The ball last night was very agreeable. Loads of partners, but I was obliged to dance with Gilby. Oh, and do you know, Aunt Renew, I am desperately afraid I have rather cut out Margaret, which discomposes me more than I can express. But more of this when we have a little private chat. I danced with Mr Stansfield, Mr Tom Bischoff, Mr Fenton, besides Ralph and Gilby, and I was engaged to a gentlemanly officer of the Bays, a Mr Ferguson and a Mr Baird, a nephew of Sir David's, such a griff, as well as another Mr Fenton, and lots more whose names even I cannot recollect. It was a small ball, but very pleasant considering. I beg leave to say I have made a conquest of a banker who has a fortune of about £2,000 a year, an excellent house, and is a most delightful person. His name is Greenwood. He is not handsome. The Benyons are very pleasant people and have been most polite. Tell father that old Mr Bischoff very kindly took me yesterday to try one of Stoddart's new combination pianos. It is excessively powerful, but I do not think very pleasing. The strings are braced on copper, and consequently the sounding board being free makes the sound vibrate, in my opinion, too much. I have scarcely yet recovered from the delight of the music. There is going to be a grand musical festival here for 3 days in November, and Mrs Appleby is kind enough to say that we must pay her a visit at that time. We are going to see Hurst's manufactory. Mr William Bishop will call for us in his carriage to escort us. And if tomorrow should be very fine, we have some idea of walking to Kirkstall Abbey, but I think we shall be knocked up. If Sunday had not intervened, we should have been with you a day sooner, because Sunday will be a most dismal day. I saw a young man of the largest fortune in this part of the county last night, but alas, not in a state fit for a ballroom. It was young Mr Wormold. Such a nice-looking young man, but so excessively drunk with some of his friends that it was with the greatest difficulty they could stagger up the room to a seat where they amused themselves by tossing up 400s. There is a sad raff, a certain Captain Taylor, who has got hold of him and makes him drunk, as it is thought, to fleece him of his money. We have just had Miss Stansfield to call on me, who is looking very old and very ugly. She desired her remembrances. Mr Tom Bischoff has also just called on me. We are to start by the steamboat on Monday at 9 o'clock from Selby, and if we do not stick on a sandbank, which the fates I hope will forbid in pity, we shall be in Hull about 2 o'clock, when I should like to have the horses meet me, that I may get home as soon as possible. For I assure you, though I am exceedingly amused and much made of here, I long to see you all again after so long an absence, and moreover, I must have a day of rest before the York ball on Wednesday. Now, my dearest Christopher, do prithee exert thyself, and use thy influence to persuade my dad and yourself to aid my going to so gay an affair, and your petitioner will ever remain your most affectionate sister Matilda. Mrs Basfield has just written to Margaret. I hope that the whole party will adjourn to Lipwood and stay with her, but we are so anxious to manage the officers' ball at York that supersedes everything. Give my best remembrances to Polly, and thank her for her kind epistle. I am very glad to hear that Bob is so well, and that you are so good a nurse. Remember the York ball. People call without end. Notes on Matilda's second 1823 letter from Leeds. The penny black was the first postage stamp in England and was first used in May 1840. Before then, postage costs were paid by the person who received the letter, so people only wrote a letter to someone who they knew would be able to pay to receive it. Matilda is apologising to Christopher for sending a second, costly letter. The poor, of course, could not afford to send letters. They preferred to eat instead. Matilda has sent a second letter to her brother after only a few days because she's now staying in Leeds longer than originally planned. She now needs Christopher to send the servants to Hull with the horses on Monday, not on Saturday. I simply cannot imagine having to make travel plans by letter. I absolutely love doing online fact checking. Stoddart were a London firm that built the pianoforte, and in 1821 they applied for a patent for a new type of piano. I've just read all about it in the Quarterly Musical Magazine and Review, Volume 3 from 1821. The Stoddart combination piano was exactly as Matilda described in her letter. At the end of the 1700s, Stoddart was working on combination instruments, which were a cross between a harpsichord and the more modern piano, which we know today. Pianos were becoming more popular as dynamics were possible. A musician can't vary dynamics when playing a harpsichord. William Hurst was another Yorkshireman who was influential in the Industrial Revolution. He became known as the father of the Yorkshire woolen trade. He grew up in poverty and then worked his way up in the trade. He realised that cloth manufactured in Yorkshire, which was finished by hand, was of a lesser quality than cloth from the west of England that was finished by machine. He took financial risks and was very unpopular, but his modern machinery revolutionised the industry. He became wealthy and successful, and in 1818 was making cloth for the Prince Regent, who later became George IV. He generously shared his ideas with others, and he also opened his mills for inspection by visitors and potential competitors. In 1823, Mr Bishop called on Matilda in his carriage and escorted her and her companions to visit the factory of Mr Hurst, to see these modern machines for making cloth. Perhaps he proposed to Matilda as well, and she declined. Mr Hurst was now wealthy, but unfortunately he did not take out patents on his new technology. He made poor business decisions and he went bankrupt. But he was a local lad who made good, and was a significant part of the Industrial Revolution in Yorkshire. Kirkstall Abbey is still there. It's a beautiful ruin set in gardens next to the River Aire. It is another of the monasteries which were dissolved by Henry VIII in the 1500s. The 10 siblings visited another monastery which became a ruin due to Henry VIII in 1907 on their bicycling tour, Tintern Abbey. It's 3 miles from East Parade to Kirkstall Abbey, which is 4.8 kilometres. I would be surprised if young ladies walked that far in the 1800s, but maybe they did. Entertainingly, it appears that being knocked up in the 1800s meant you were feeling tired. When I was growing up in London, the phrase had a completely different meaning. Matilda and her companions are wealthy young ladies. They are out in society and they're looking for husbands. She was in Leeds in 1823 to go to concerts and attend different balls. In later years, she will go to London for the season. Matilda describes several balls she goes to, who she dances with, who is agreeable and who is not. She has made a conquest of a banker called Mr Greenwood, who has a fortune of £2,000 a year, but he is not handsome, and Matilda is not interested. Matilda was very choosy. She didn't get married until the age of 28. Dr Cox states that she had a lot of offers, and she turned down a lot of suitors. Matilda has danced with Gilby, who I think was probably a friend, and Gilby is now entranced with Matilda. But Margaret, who is Matilda's companion, has feelings for Gilby. Matilda says, "This discomposes me more than I can express." Female jealousy in the 1800s. Oh, to be a fly on the wall when Matilda told Christopher the whole story when they got back home. Young men with the largest of fortunes are completely drunk at a party, and other young men are trying to steal the young drunkard's fortune. It's all very easy to picture. Matilda is talking about disreputable young men who are drunkards and gamblers, and she describes them as a raff, R-A-F-F. I've never heard of this word before, but it looks like it might be an abbreviation for riff-raff. I also have no idea what Matilda means when she describes a young man as a griff, G-R-I-F-F. Dr Cox and Vera had transcribed Matilda's handwritten letters, and they were typed up for the 1912 Christmas budget, so the word is clearly typed as griff. But it's likely that Matilda wrote her letter on a small sheet of notepaper. Then she would have rotated the paper 90 degrees and wrote across the page again, so the page was used twice. Dr Cox and Vera did well to be able to transcribe her handwriting. I'm sure I would struggle. Possibly the word was mistyped, and Matilda maybe described the young man as a raff or a riff. Interesting, who knows? If you do know anything about griff or riff or raff, do please email me and tell me. And Miss Stansfield has been to the East Parade House to call on Matilda, and she's looking very old and very ugly. And Miss Stansfield says, "Oh, do remember me to your family, my dear." Matilda is clearly tired of callers. She is weary of sitting politely in the drawing room, doing her needlework, and she is looking forward to returning to Beverley for a lengthy gossip with her brother. If someone travelled from Selby to Hull today, it would take 56 minutes by car. Matilda expects it will take them 5 hours to travel by steamboat, and she hopes they won't get stuck on a sandbank. And lastly, Matilda is desperate to go to the officers' ball at York. She says it will be too expensive to post it to York for one day. She's not talking about posting letters. She's talking about travelling in a rented post-chaise, which was a type of carriage. So her solution is a combination of riding on horseback and also using Ralph and Margaret's gig and horse. I think Ralph and Margaret are probably brother and sister. She has worked out the accommodation and the chaperones, but she needs permission from her father and her brother. Matilda drops into old-fashioned Shakespearean language to help make her point. "Now, my dearest Christopher, do prithee exert thyself and use thy influence to persuade my dad and yourself to aid my going to so gay an affair, and your petitioner will ever remain your most affectionate sister, Matilda. P.S. Remember the York ball. People call without end." I don't know about you, but it's hard to imagine being female, 23 years old, no job, no education, no income, and having to persuade your father into giving permission to attend a party that involved riding 32 miles, 51 kilometres on horseback. Matilda's only role in life was to find a suitable husband and have some children. But she was living at home with an older brother. They were great friends and they enjoyed a good gossip. No wonder Matilda was so choosy about agreeing to a marriage. Well, sadly, I have no idea if father said yes, and if Matilda and her friends made it to York for the ball in April 1823. You will have to imagine for yourself how the story developed. The next letter in my Matilda collection was written in 1825, I think, and I will read it in the next podcast. Matilda is taking the sea air. She's staying at Bridlington, which is not far from Scarborough on the east coast, and she is with various companions, several of whom are old. Matilda is in despair. She has to promenade with nasty Colonel Donington along the seafront. She is escorted by him morning, noon and night, and clearly she has no say in the matter. There is a piano that Matilda can play, but it's a terrible one, and Matilda writes to Christopher saying please send some piano music. She warns Christopher, "You must not disappoint me if you do not wish to hear of my throwing myself into the sea in a fit of despair when my ire is at the highest, when I am parading with that vile colonel." And then I'm going to jump back to 1908, where Vera and Bernard have gone to ride on the flip-flap and also to watch the 1908 London Olympic marathon race at White City. I have actually read Vera's letter before, in season 1, but I've got some interesting extras to add this time. My friend Emma Clearbury is the daughter of John Disley, who was an Olympic medalist and also co-founder of the London Marathon, which was first run in 1981. Emma is going to join me for an episode of 100 Years of Cox. I will read Vera's marathon letter again, and we're going to have a chat about all things marathon related. With Emma in England and me in Australia, this will be an interesting recording challenge. Watch this space. 100 Years of Cox. The Machell Cox budget letters and all content is subject to copyright and belongs to both myself and the Bodleian Library in Oxford. You have been listening to 100 Years of Cox. Thank you for listening.